Welcome to AI Paper Slot. Today we are looking at Mage-Flow, an efficient native resolution foundation model for image generation and editing by the Microsoft Mage Team from July 2026.
Yeah, this one is huge.
It really is. If you're building or, deploying generative vision models, this paper is your blueprint for stack-level efficiency. We're getting straight into it today because the core insights are just staggering.
Absolutely.
So Mage-Flow is this compact 4 billion parameter generative stack that proves you do not need massive parameter scaling for state-of-the-art generation and editing. The architecture relies on three pillars. First, a lightweight one-step diffusion tokenizer called Mage-VAE.
Right, which completely overhauls the latent space.
Exactly. Second is a native resolution multimodal diffusion transformer, or NR-MMDiT, which uses flash attention to pack variable length sequences instead of rigid resolution buckets.
That's the 1D packing trick.
Yeah. And third, stack-level CUDA kernel fusion that boosts training hardware utilization, or MFU, from basically 14% up to 29%.
Which is massive for actual training budgets.
Huge. And the result? The four-step turbo variants generate 124 by 124 images in 0.59 seconds and edit in 1.02 seconds on a single A100 GPU.
Wow.
Yeah, it maintains a peak memory footprint of under 20 gigabytes and still goes toe-to-toe with 30 billion parameter giants on benchmarks like Geneval and Get-It-Bench.
It's really a masterclass in treating a generative model as a holistic software and hardware system, not just some mathematical abstraction.
Right.
When you look at the tokenizer, the backbone, and the system kernels as a unified engineering problem, a 4 billion parameter model can punch way above its weight class.
So to understand how Mage-Flow runs so efficiently, we have to start at the very first pipeline bottleneck, right? Tokenization.
Oh yeah, the VAE bottleneck.
Because if your VAE chokes on high-res images, your ultra-fast backbone just doesn't matter. They point out a huge flaw in current public VAEs like FLUX.2 or SD3.
Right, because the open source community sort of inherited these VAE architectures from the original VTGN days.
Built for like 256 by 256 images.
Exactly, and when you scale those legacy models to modern 1K or 2K generation, the computational cost just scales quadratically. They use global attention blocks.
Meaning every pixel has to look at every single other pixel.
Yeah, combined with multi-step compute. So if you're trying to push them to natively process 4C96 by 4C96, they literally just, they run out of memory.
Which completely defeats the purpose of having a fast generation backbone.
Right. The tokenization latency starts to rival the actual diffusion process.
Which brings us to the Mage-VAE. And the raw savings here are wild. They achieve 12 times fewer encoding MX and 22 times fewer decoding MX per pixel.
That's not an incremental update.
No, 12x and 22x is a structural overhaul. How did they actually do that without destroying the image quality?
Well, they stripped out the global attention entirely. They treated the tokenizer basically as a learned image codec. The decoder is a fully convolutional one-step pixel diffusion model.
Based on that prior Codelight research.
Right. Exactly. By using stacked convolutional diffusion blocks and distilling it to a single step, the decoding latency becomes almost linear with image resolution.
Because convolution is local.
Right, it only looks at neighboring pixels. But the really elegant part is the structural symmetry. Since a decoder generates pixels conditioned on latence, they built the encoder as its architectural dual. It's a one-step diffusion model generating latence conditioned on pixels.
Okay, let's unpack this. Standard VAEs are acting like an inefficient translator who has to read the entire book to translate a single page.
Right, because of that global attention.
But Mage-VAE acts like a simultaneous interpreter.
Well,
but wait, they train this using an anchor latent KL loss, right? Meaning they regularize its posterior toward the latent distribution of FLUX.2 VAE?
Yes, instead of a standard Gaussian prior.
So if it's explicitly trained to match FLUX.2, doesn't that inherently put a hard ceiling on its quality? I mean, can it ever be better than FLUX.2, or is it doomed to just be an efficient clone?
That's a really valid question. But the goal here isn't necessarily to surpass FLUX.2's theoretical peak reconstruction.
Okay.
The goal is to create a generation-ready space, right? By matching the FLUX.2 distribution, you ensure cross-generator compatibility and get a highly stable training target.
So you match the quality but lose the overhead.
Exactly. It matches FLUX.2 VAE on the CLIC 2020 benchmark but it completely eliminates the memory bottleneck. It gives the rest of the model the thermal headroom to actually shine.
Right. So we have these ultra-fast latents. But how does the 4B transformer handle them? Because the industry standard right now is bucket-based training.
Yeah, forcing images into predefined resolution buckets.
Right, which discretizes native resolutions and just wastes so much compute.
It really does. You get bucket quantization mismatch, images get resized awkwardly or padded out, and you severely limit the diversity of aspect ratios the model sees.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Mage-Flow introduces the native resolution MMDiT. Instead of buckets, it takes the latents and the text, which comes from Qwen3VL, by the way, and just flattens them into 1D sequences.
Which sounds counterintuitive at first.
It does. It packs these heterogeneous sequences into a single contiguous batch up to a fixed token budget using flash attention variable length kernels.
Right.
It's like instead of rigidly fitting oddly shaped items into standard FedEx boxes and wasting negative space, they're playing perfect one-dimensional Tetris. But I have to ask, does removing buckets actually help the model learn better, or is this purely a software trick to save GPU cycles?
Oh, it definitely helps it learn better. But to your earlier point about flattening into 1D, you might wonder how it keeps spatial layouts intact.
Yeah, doesn't it lose the 2D structure?
It would, except they use per-sample 2D rotary positional embeddings, or ROP. So mathematically, the model perfectly understands the original X and Y coordinates, even within that packed 1D sequence.
Yeah, okay.
And because you aren't cropping or distorting images to fit arbitrary buckets, the model learns the true native distribution of the data.
That makes sense. And they even extend this packing to inference, right? With PackCFG.
Yes. Classifier-free guidance usually means evaluating a conditional and unconditional branch separately.
Running it twice.
Exactly. But with packed CFG, they pack both branches into one forward pass. It boosts inference speed by like 1.09x to 1.15x.
So we have perfect Tetris packing, we have lightweight latents, but as any ML engineer knows, great math means absolutely nothing if the GPUs are starved waiting for memory transfers.
Memory-bound overhead is the silent killer.
Right. You've got these repeated blocks, normalization, ROP, gating, residual additions in the VAE and the MMDiT.
And if you launch those as separate CUDA kernels, you generate massive VRAM read and write traffic.
It's awful. The compute cores just sit idle. So the engineering solution here is custom-fused CUDA kernels. By fusing these operator chains, intermediate values stay on chip.
Exactly. You avoid hitting the main memory over and over.
The numbers on this are insane. This optimization bumped model FLOP utilization, or MFU, from 13.88% to 29.28%.
More than double.
Yeah. It reduced peak per GPU memory from 175 gigabytes to 141 gigabytes during training, and yielded an end-to-end training speedup of 2.48x. So what does this all mean? Everyone fixates on parameter count, right? Like, oh, this is only a 4B model. But looking at these numbers, should the research community be obsessing just as much over stack-level memory traffic and MFU as they do over their transformer layers?
100%. I mean, an architecture with brilliant math that operates at 14% MFU is just wasting time and money.
Right.
When you optimize the memory traffic and fuse the kernels, a 4B model can iterate faster, train on more data, and ultimately outcompete poorly optimized models that have 10 times the parameters.
Wow. Okay, so we've established an incredibly efficient base training loop.
Yeah.
But how do they go from a raw foundation model to the 4-step turbo variants?
That's where the alignment and distillation come in.
Right, because if you compress it that much, doesn't the image just fall apart into a pixelated mess?
Usually, yes. First, they do post-training alignment using Diffusion NFT, which is negative-aware fine-tuning on the forward process.
Just to improve prompt adherence in text rendering.
Yeah. But the real magic for the 4-step turbo is the distillation process, specifically decoupled DMD.
Decoupled distribution matching distillation.
Exactly. In standard distillation, CFG augmentation and distribution matching are tied together. That causes huge instability in few-step regimes.
They start fighting each other.
Right. So they separate them with independent noise schedules to prevent that instability. But to prevent the images from getting blurry and losing detail, they use adversarial perceptual guidance.
Using frozen vision foundation models, right?
Yeah.
DynoV2 and CLAP.
Yes, as feature discriminators to provide adversarial gradients. It stops the 4-step student model from losing those high-frequency visual details.
Which is always the tension in distillation, right? Compressing trajectories usually destroys perceptual detail. But is the real secret sauce here using completely frozen established models like DynoV2 and CLAP as the critics?
It plays a huge role.
Because if we didn't have those frozen external anchors, Would this four-step turbo model just collapse?
The ablation studies in the paper strongly suggest it would lose a significant amount of visual fidelity. Those frozen models act as semantic anchors. They force the student to maintain realistic textures that mathematical distillation alone tends to smooth over.
That is so clever. And I noticed they mixed general generation data into the instruction-based editing training data.
Yes, that was specifically to improve the category-wise robustness.
The MGEDIT scores went up.
Right. Significantly. Because by mixing the data, you prevent catastrophic forgetting. The model remains a good general generator even while it's learning to follow specific editing instructions.
Like, look at the receipts. Because does this highly optimized 4B stack actually compete with the 30 billion parameter giants out in the wild?
Oh, it absolutely does.
Just recapping the specs, 18 to 20 gigabytes peak VRAM, 0.59 seconds per generation, 1.02 seconds per edit on an A100, and it beats models 3 times its size, like Beagle 14B and ENU3 Gen 8B on Genevol and DBG Bench.
It's incredibly competitive.
It competes fiercely with FLUX.2 Dev, which is 32 billion parameters, and it reached the top open source score on GetItBench Chinese. But the ultimate stress test here was fine-tuning on Sforma, the scientific diagram generation dataset.
Which is a brutally hard task.
Extremely hard. I mean, it requires synchronous correctness across dense text, directional arrows, global topology. And Mage-Flow Sforma successfully matches a 9 billion parameter domain-specific model.
Right, which proves the MMDiT architecture is incredibly sound.
It really points out the absurdity of benchmarks today, doesn't it? Like,
Yeah.
models are getting so good at generating photorealistic humans or food. Is asking an AI to draw a complex, accurate scientific diagram the only way left to truly stress test if a model understands structure versus just hallucinating a pretty picture?
It really might be. Human faces and landscapes have a lot of aesthetic leeway.
Yeah, if a leaf is out of place, you don't notice.
Exactly. But a scientific diagram, a single hallucinated arrow or misaligned text block ruins the entire structural integrity. The fact that a 4B model handles that density speaks volumes about the sequence packing and the ROP implementation.
It's incredible. So to wrap up the core thesis of Mage-Flow, it proves you really do not need 80 billion parameters if you co-design the tokenizer, the backbone, and the system kernels in unison.
It completely validates the stack-level optimization approach.
It makes local desktop deployment of SOTA models an actual reality, which leaves you with one final question to mull over. If a 4 billion parameter model can achieve this level of high-resolution fidelity and speed simply by eliminating system bottlenecks and optimizing the tokenization pipeline, what happens when these exact same stack-level efficiencies are applied to an 80 billion or 100 billion parameter model?
That is the terrifying and exciting question.
Right. Like, will we hit a hard ceiling on our training data quality? Or will that optimization finally usher in the era of real-time 4K generation of interactive virtual worlds? Food for thought. Thanks for joining us today.